The dawn after the storm of their wedding night broke clear and brilliant, washing the adobe walls in pale gold. Ara woke to the solid weight of Cade's arm draped over her waist, his chest a warm, steady wall against her back. For a moment, she simply lay there, absorbing the reality of it. The bargain had been sealed in flesh and fire, and the world had not ended. It had begun. He stirred behind her, his hand splayed possessively across her stomach. "You're awake!" His voice was a sleep-roughened rumble against her ear. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she confirmed, turning in his embrace to face him. In the soft morning light, the harsh lines of his face were relaxed. The glacial ice in his eyes warmed to a quiet, startling intensity as he looked at her. He didn't smile, but the way his gaze traced her features was a language all its own. "Are you, well?" He hesitated, a rare flicker of uncertainty in the man, who never seemed to doubt anything. "I'm well," she assured him, her cheeks warming. "More than well." That seemed to satisfy him. His expression shifted back to its familiar, determined focus. "Good. The work doesn't stop for a wedding." He rose from the bed, a powerful, unself-conscious silhouette against the window, and began to dress. The intimacy of the night was giving way to the practicality of the day, but the connection hummed between them, a new, unbreakable thread that transcended their initial transaction. The change in their dynamic was immediate and profound. Where before there had been a guarded silence, now there was a quiet, deep-seated understanding. He no longer just left food for her. He waited for her to join him, his gaze lingering on her as she moved about their kitchen. Their kitchen. He started telling her things, not just issuing orders, but providing information. He pointed out the window to a distant mesa, its peak shrouded in morning mist. "The Crenshaw gang was last spotted near there. If they ride into my town, there will be trouble." Ara placed a plate before him, its simple heartiness reflecting their new life. "Our town," she corrected softly, meeting his gaze. His eyes met hers, and he gave a slow, single nod. "Our town." Their days fell into a demanding, productive rhythm. Ara began to accompany him on his necessary public rounds, not as a sheltered burden, but as his legitimate partner. The townsfolk, who had watched her with calculating curiosity or open pity, now looked at her with a new kind of respect. She was no longer just the marshal's mail-order bride. She was Sullivan's woman, and her presence was a quiet declaration of his permanence in Silver Bend. She saw how his very presence, heavy and unwavering, could calm disputes before they started, how a single cold look from him could silence a rowdy saloon patron. She was learning the internal map of his power, and she was becoming an indispensable part of its foundation. The true weight of that partnership descended one afternoon when the Phoebe, well-dressed man from the territorial bank, the one with the slick demeanor and condescending smile, arrived again. He spread papers on their rough-hewn table, speaking of liens and obligations on properties throughout Silver Bend, including the land their very house stood on. "The previous owner had certain debts, you see," the man said, his smile failing to reach his nervous eyes. "The bank is prepared to be reasonable, Marshal, but we must have a resolution, a transfer of deed." Cade's expression was granite, a storm brewing in his eyes, his hand already resting near the butt of his Colt, but before he could speak, before he could resort to the violence that was his default solution, Ara stepped forward. She picked up one of the documents, her sharp mind trained in the ledgers and legal texts of her father's failed Boston business, scanning the dense, fine print. "This interest calculation is usurious, sir," she said, her voice cool, clear, and utterly devoid of tremor. "And this clause regarding immediate transfer of ownership upon default is invalid under the Arizona Territorial Code of 1864, Section 12. My father was a corporate lawyer. I may have only been his secretary, but I learned enough to recognize a predatory contract designed to seize assets unlawfully." She set the paper down, meeting the banker's startled, paling gaze without flinching. "I suggest you take these back to your superiors and have them thoroughly reviewed for legality. My husband and I will not be intimidated by what amounts to criminal extortion." The silence in the room was absolute. The banker, faced with legal precision rather than frontier muscle, gathered his papers with mumbled excuses and fled the house. When the stout door closed with a firm thud, Cade turned to her. He didn't speak for a long moment, just looked at her as if seeing her for the very first time, seeing the full scope of the intellect he had inadvertently acquired. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, soul-deep recognition and victory. "You," he said, his voice thick with amazed emotion, "are a constant necessary surprise." That night, their lovemaking shifted again. It was slower, more deliberate, a deep, worshipful exploration of the bond that went far beyond their initial bargain. His whispers against her skin spoke of pride, of dependence, and a devotion that was now anchored not just in possession, but in genuine partnership. It was a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, and she knew then that their commitment was as unyielding and enduring as the desert canyons themselves. But the fragile peace of their growing bond was shattered by the inevitability of the Crenshaw threat. Cade knew that the loss of Riggs, the drunken, belligerent deputy who had served as the gang's spy, had left a vacuum that Crenshaw would rush to fill, desperate to prove that the marshal was isolated and weak. Ara's legal victory over the bank only hastened the physical attack. The territorial interests were now aligned with the outlaws in their mutual desire to destabilize Silver Bend and remove its stubborn marshal. "They will assume vulnerability," Ara stated, studying the map with Cade. "But they'll ride in to make a statement, to re-establish dominance over you. They want the bank's haul, yes, but they want your reputation broken more. They want the town to choose their fear over your protection." Cade nodded, the grim acceptance heavy on his face. He knew what her sharp mind had deduced. The house, their home, would be the target. It was the symbol of their union and the foundation of Cade's legal claim. They spent the next 2 days fortifying the adobe structure. Cade taught her to use the rifle with lethal competence behind the house, his large body anchoring her stance, his voice a steady command in her ear. "Hold steady, breathe out, ride the recoil." She fired until the metallic scent of gunpowder replaced the desert air, learning the economy of motion required for survival. Ara, meanwhile, used her knowledge to organize the defense beyond bullets. She cataloged their legal cache, the deeds, the marriage license, the documentation of Riggs's corrupt activities, ensuring that if the house burned, the paperwork that legitimized their presence and authority would survive in a metal box buried deep in the cellar. The house became a siege fortress, but the shared danger deepened their bond until their every glance, every touch, every movement was charged with a dual purpose: survival and devotion. It was late in the afternoon when she heard them, the heavy coordinated drumming of multiple horses, not the sound of travel, but the measured gait of menace. "Cade," she called, her voice dropping into the low, calm register he had taught her. He was at the window instantly, the Colt already in his hand. 10 men, he stated flatly, headed straight for the house. Crenshaw himself. "The cellar," he ordered, turning to her, his face granite. "Take the documents, the water, and the rifle. Do not come up until I call your name." "No," she said, moving not toward the cellar door, but toward the corner where the heavy repeating rifle stood. She checked the load, her hands steady. "We agreed, partner. They are here to take your reputation. I am your credibility. I will not hide when you need a witness most, especially a witness with a rifle." Cade stared at her, the conflict of protectiveness warring with proud astonishment visible in his eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Upstairs, then. The second-story window gives the best view of the street. Stay low. Wait for my signal." Clang, clang, clang. A fist hammered on the stout front door, rattling the timber. "Marshal Sullivan," a voice boomed, thick with menace. "We know you're in there. You got something of ours. Hand over the hoard and the star, and we'll leave your fortress standing." Cade walked slowly to the door, placing the barrel of his Colt against the wall beside the frame. "You're talking about Riggs. He's not yours anymore. He was a snake, and I cut him loose. As for my wife, she's not for sale, and I do not retreat." "Then you die alone, Marshal," Crenshaw snarled. Crack! The first shot splintered the wood of the door near Cade's head. The siege had begun. Cade's voice, a steady low boom, came from downstairs. "Ara, they're moving to the sides. Take the first man who tries the back window." Ara knelt at the upstairs window, the heavy rifle stock nestled against her shoulder, her heart hammered, but her hands were steady. She tracked a lean, quick figure trying to scale the low back fence for a flanking maneuver. She remembered Cade's voice, focused on the scent of gunpowder and sage. Hold steady. Breathe out. She pulled the trigger. Crack! The shot was clean and true. The man screamed, clutching his bloody leg, and fell. A roar of surprise and fury went up from the gang. They had expected the marshal to be alone, a wounded lion in his den. They hadn't expected the Eastern bride to be armed, capable, and lethal. The fight lasted until dusk, a terrifying symphony of gunfire, shouts, and the heavy thud of bullets burying themselves in the thick adobe walls. Ara reloaded with practiced speed, moving from the front-facing window to the back, covering Cade as he moved, forcing the gang to keep their distance and exposing their vulnerability. "You're making a grave mistake, Crenshaw," Cade yelled into the fading light, his voice strained but strong. "You try to ride into my town and kill its marshal. You've just declared war on the territory. Not a single man here will stand for you." "They already have, Sullivan. They're hiding in their saloons, praying we kill you," Crenshaw shot back, his voice edged with desperation as his assault failed to breach the walls. And for a moment, it was true. The town was silent, its windows dark and shuttered. Then, a voice, high and trembling but resolute, rose from the boardwalk. "That's a lie, Crenshaw! This is not just the marshal's fight." It was Preacher Miller, the traveling minister who had married them, standing out in the open, his worn Bible clutched to his chest. Marshal Sullivan stood up to the banker's greed. He brought justice to Riggs's corruption. "We are here. We were just waiting for a sign of courage." Miller's voice was the catalyst. Windows across the street flew open, and a scattering of shots, from the store owner, the blacksmith, a few courageous ranch hands, began to rain down on the flanks of the Crenshaw gang. Crenshaw roared in frustration, his psychological warfare shattered. He had gambled that the town's fear of him outweighed their respect for the marshal, and he had lost. "Retreat! Retreat!" he bellowed. "We'll be back for you, Sullivan." They rode away, their horses kicking up dust, leaving 3 wounded, terrified men behind in the road. Cade, breathing hard, finally allowed himself to slump against the doorframe, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. He was covered in sweat and dust, his dark duster torn at the shoulder, but he was whole. Ara dropped the rifle and rushed downstairs, throwing herself into his arms. He crushed her against his chest, his large hands anchoring her to him, the fear and relief in his hold palpable. "You," he murmured, burying his face in her hair. "You saved us. The shot from the window. The courage. You were the reason they broke." She stepped back, breathless, but her eyes were already on the scene outside, focused not on the outlaws, but on the legal necessity of the moment. "The bargain, Cade. I was the witness. Now I need to take statements from those wounded men and Preacher Miller. The territorial court will need proof of self-defense and proof of their terrorist intent to establish a legal foundation for your actions." He looked at her, his wife, the elegant Bostonian who had just successfully held a gang of outlaws at bay, and his face broke into a fierce, final expression of pride. "Go on, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, the title now ringing with deep reverence. "The law waits." The immediate aftermath was Ara's victory. While Cade handled the tactical cleanup, securing the wounded prisoners and disarming the town, Ara took charge of the legal battlefield. She interviewed the prisoners, noting every boast and threat, and then spent hours transcribing Preacher Miller's and the townsfolk's testimonies. She framed the affidavits not as a simple gunfight, but as an act of legal defense by the duly appointed marshal against a criminal insurrection aimed at overturning law and order. Her documentation was so meticulous, so damning, that when the territorial judge finally arrived a week later to review the situation, he had no choice but to authorize an official territorial warrant for the arrest of Elias Crenshaw and the remaining gang members. Ara had turned a messy frontier shootout into a federal case, giving Cade the necessary official mandate to hunt down his enemy. Cade's physical recovery was quick, but the emotional shift was profound. He watched Ara work, his gaze following her as she commanded respect, spoke Latin legal phrases, and negotiated the town's defenses. One evening, she found him staring into the fireplace, cleaning his Colt with ritualistic care. "It's done, Cade," she said softly. "You have the warrant. You've won the legal battle." "The legal battle," he repeated, his voice heavy. "I used to think my star was enough, that the fastest gun was the law. You showed me the paper and words are sharper than any bullet. He looked up, his ice blue eyes holding a rare vulnerability. When I left you upstairs, knowing the fire they were putting on the house, I thought I'd lose the only thing I've ever truly claimed. He stood, closing the distance between them. I need you, Ara. Not just as a witness, but as my conscience. My strategy, my damn everything. He took her hand, the scarred, lethal tool of his trade, and pressed it to his lips. The bargain was that I provide the protection. You do that now too. You protect me from my own violent instincts. Ara's heart swelled with a fierce, protective love. The transaction had dissolved. What remained was a marriage forged in danger and mutual necessity. Then, let's finish this, Marshal, she replied, her voice steady. We ride out together. You track the man, I carry the law. 2 days later, they left Silver Bend. Ara, mounted on a sturdy bay mare, rode beside Cade. She wore a tailored riding skirt and a wide-brimmed hat, and the rifle was slung across her back. She carried the meticulously prepared legal documents and a new sense of purpose. Their pursuit of Crenshaw took them deep into the unforgiving canyons. Cade was a silent, relentless tracker, navigating the broken terrain with an intuitive grace that made him seem part of the land. Ara, though physically challenged by the ride, matched his pace, using her keen observation skills to note details he might miss. A specific brand on a stray horse, a piece of fabric snagged on a thorny bush. They finally cornered Crenshaw and his remaining men at a derelict mine shack high in the mountains. The final confrontation was swift and inevitable. Crenshaw tried to use Ara as leverage, grabbing her and holding a knife to her throat, roaring for Cade to drop his weapon. "Drop it, Sullivan, or I take what's yours." Cade didn't hesitate. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his voice was measured. "I offered my wife a bargain, Crenshaw. Protection. I always keep my word." And he fired, a calculated shot that grazed Ara's shoulder but sent the bullet sinking deep into Crenshaw's gun hand. As Crenshaw roared and stumbled, Ara spun out of his grip. Cade was on him in an instant, the fight a blur of brutal, efficient blows, ending with Cade's boot firmly on Crenshaw's chest. Ara, nursing her bleeding shoulder, stepped forward, the territorial warrant held high. She read the charges in a clear, resonant voice that echoed off the canyon walls, charges of attempted murder, robbery, and criminal insurrection. Crenshaw, defeated not just by the marshal's strength, but by the unstoppable force of the law he represented, spat in the dirt. They rode back into Silver Bend a week later, the prisoner's trust and in tow. The town poured out onto the street, cheering not just for the marshal, but for Ara Sullivan, the woman who had secured their future. The initial bargain was truly forgotten. Ara had not merely found a way out of debt. She had found a life of purpose, a home, and a terrifying, unshakable love with the hardest man in the territory. Their marriage was not a transaction, it was a fortress, built of adobe, iron, law, and shared fire, standing resolute against the chaos of the frontier. The marshal's due had been paid, and in return, he had been given a destiny, secured by the sharp mind and steady aim of his wife. She had whispered to him that their journey was only beginning, and as she stood beside him, watching the sun set over the town they had saved together, Ara knew the life they were building. Hand in the hand of a man who was both a weapon and a sanctuary, was exactly where she was meant to be. The end of the line was truly the beginning of everything.